Hi, everybody. So my name is Dr. Kyra Bobinet, and I'm here to talk about why behavior design is absolutely essential to healthcare. And of course, our problem here is that it's missing right now, currently, for the large part. And so we're going to go over, kind of my experience of where it's residing, where it's working, where it's not working, and kind of map out the whole thing. So Marguerite's going to help me advance. Thank you so much. So as many of you know, my thesis here is this kind of why don't we do what we know we should do? And this is sort of the common human experience, it's the common human frustration. And especially in healthcare, it can be deadly when we don't take our medicine or we don't get that thing checked out on our back, or we don't look at that rash. Those kinds of things are the mismatch of even our own survival, our own well-being, or even our own outcomes. And so this is part of the reason why the advent of behavior design and neuroscience design coming into healthcare is absolutely life-saving and important to all of us and all of the people that we know and love. And there's a couple of sort of common themes here that we all experience. So number one is when we try to change our behavior, we might basically we might have an intention that doesn't actually manifest as anything. The next level of sort of disappointment is being able to do, oh wait, go back one. We're just working out the cadence here. We have things on our to-do list that maybe we don't even pay attention to anymore because we become blind to them. They've been on there for so long. Anybody have any stale items on their to-do list today that you know are too long? All right, next one. We're also very distractible, as it turns out, and actually increasingly so because of the technology, these little phones that we use, and those kinds of things that actually I need to, wait, whose password is this? I forgot to hit play, I think, so recording-wise. So as I'm proving right now, we are very distracted by these things. Yeah, we'll see how it goes. All right. I was focusing on that and not on this. Sorry about that. Okay, so we're very distractible, just like I proved right now. And then the next one is we self-sabotage. And of course, myself, I'm the worst self-saboteur in the world. I always, mean to do this. And then as soon as it starts going well, and as soon as I start getting some progress, I find some subconscious way to kind of, go backwards or try to get away with my old behaviors, that kind of thing. It's a little fun game I play with myself to make my life more difficult. Next one. And then, of course, we relapse fully sometimes. We just full out, go down the tubes and, do our old thing. And, we can get triggered into very primitive, young, immature places within ourselves. All right, so next one. So what's exactly happening to us, as I have, came to conclude, is the brain, as we know it, has more complexity and wiring to our behavior that's very specific. And once you know the wiring, then you can solve for the problems. Next. So my journey really quickly, and I'll go through this very quickly, is I started out as an MD at UCSF, and I wanted to be a surgeon. Next. And then I started volunteering in juvenile hall, and I was super fascinated by this discrepancy between what the youth wanted to do and what they would do. They wanted to stop doing crime, but they inevitably went back over and over again. And spent about 10 years really focusing on what does it take to change behavior at this level across age, across ethnographic, across socioeconomic status, across culture, those kinds of things. And in doing so, I really came to rest on the common thread of all human development. So that was one sort of. And then I was also doing some clinical work, and I had a patient who had a gouty toe, which was caused by doing meth amphetamine 3 days ago, and he had gone to sleep, and so he got dehydrated, and now he has this painful toe. And I was writing a prescription, and I realized that this is not the conversation that I want to have with the world. I want to do something more fundamental to preventing this toe than writing for a pill. Okay, next one. So I went to Harvard, and I did my thesis in population health management. I'm going to show you a scale that I was working with there that I can add to your skill set today from that work, and that led to me being hired as an executive at a very large company where I would design behavioral interventions for everything from childhood obesity to elder care to vaccination to colonoscopy, every aspect of preventive medicine and things that people want to do for their health. versus what they actually did. And I became very frustrated and almost disillusioned with some of the things that, the bar was very low, first of all. If you got 5% of the people to do something, which is almost regression to the mean anyway, you were considered a success in that world. 15%, you were blowing it out of the water, But I wanted more. I wanted to know what it is that I'm missing here that I didn't learn in public health school, that I didn't learn as an MD. And I ran across B.J. Fogg's work, and I was super interested in this idea that you could design for behaviors. And I loved the fact that he was able to reduce human behavior into very simple, applicable, vehicles of the science into action, and had been doing a lot of work with healthcare and health-related companies, a lot of wellness products, and specifically this intersection with technology and behavior change. So I came here into Stanford, and I studied with him, and many of my colleagues are here in the room that I studied with. And then that inspired me to start a company called engagedIn, which is what I do right now full-time, in addition to teaching here at the medical school. Next. So at engagedIn, we basically use neuroscience to create interventions that are psychologically healthy, or psychologically positive, and unconsciously healthy. And the unconscious piece is super important because of the way that the brain works. So let's go there. Next one. And I've come to conclude that when we are talking to people, whether it's large-scale studies on diabetes or smaller studies on people who are at home trying to eat better, that kind of thing, there's two kinds of people. One is the MacGyver types, and these are kind of the designers, the people who are designing for their own behavior. These are patients and people who, whether they're taking care of an elder parent or their child with a very rare disease, they think like a designer and they start to tweak and tinker with their solution. Also, if the child's, I talked to one mother who's, taking care of a child with Lyme disease, and that disease goes up and down a lot. And so she was basically, charting the patterns of whether an intervention worked and thinking like a designer and iterating on her design. And then the second group of people are just like Homer Simpsons, and they're just kind of confused, and they just kind of like fuzz out and do their normal daily, TV watching and snack eating. Okay, next one. So today I want to talk about, three things that I think I want to leave you with. One is try to understand healthcare from this point of view, and also what's missing in healthcare. Number two is why behavior design. We want to prove to ourselves why neuroscience and behavioral science is important to solve things that you can't solve otherwise. And then the third one is just sort of some commentary and some application as it relates to behavior change, including my own story. Next one. So the first one is trying to understand healthcare. All right, this is kind of like drinking from a fire hydrant. The amount of information and proliferation, I pretty much humble myself every single day because somebody says, have you seen the latest study on X? Or did you see so-and-so's work? Or have you talked to so-and-so professor? And I'm just like, no, uncle. There's not enough time in the day to keep up with it all. So that's, if you feel obligated or like you don't know enough, it's our common experience altogether. None of us know enough. But here's a couple of things that I think are weight-bearing that you can focus on and that we can use as building blocks in this conversation. Next one. So the first thing is that we are in an unprecedented level of disruption of a $3 trillion industry. This is the largest industry in the U.S. economy and growing. And it has never been disrupted in this way before. So we're all in a very unique spot. Next one. And what we're seeing mostly as a disruption is that the money's moving. There's been so many people who have been knocking at the door of changing the system and changing the healthcare industry for a long time. They all had the same idea. They all had really good intentions around patient engagement and treating people like humans and making things safer and higher quality and being evidence-based. All those things didn't matter until the money shifted. And now the axis of the planet of healthcare is now tilted, right? So we have large, I don't know if any of you have kept up with some of the recent changes even in the last couple weeks, but there are, bundled payments coming out of, Center for Medicare and Medicaid services that are going to change very rapidly how clinical organizations are going to pivot in their revenue models. And as a result, all of the investors that invest in healthcare are going to also pivot with them and consolidate what they're doing to intervene and improve things. Next one. And we're also seeing this immense sea change of cost shifting to the individual. just a few years ago, 10 years ago, you saw a bigger contribution from employers. So, the increase in healthcare costs year over year does not account for the disparate shifting of expenses onto the individual year over year since that. So we're actually proportionally paying more for our coverage than people 10 years ago did. Next one. I want to talk a little bit about where we're at in terms of technology adoption curve, because this has everything to do with the behaviors that are normative right now, that are ready, that are right, and those that are a little far afield and not ready to adopt. I know that BJ does a tremendous amount of thought leadership around persuasive technology, behavior design kind of intersecting. And I know that in watching the industry in the last 5 to 10 years, there's different things that are possible now than there were 10 years ago. Think about Facebook. When Facebook started out, there had to be an icon and a word telling you what the icon did. And now they can just talk in symbols, and because everybody knows what the shortcut is for menu. It's 3 bars or 4 bars at the top right, or those kinds of things that have become conventions. And so there's this sort of adoption curve of normative expectations in technology that allow a population of people, most people in the population, to follow along and do new and different behaviors that they never did before. All right, so let's go through a couple of them. So in the laggard side, we're going to start with sort of the old standards in healthcare. One of them is a nurse line. If you don't have a nurse line, you're not even starting. Some people are trying to leapfrog this, which is great, but that's standard. Case managers are also standard. Next one. EMR is ubiquitous now. Suffering or no suffering, and it sucks, but it's everywhere at this point because of policy. Next one over. And these are sort of the requirements, sort of the basics of generic healthcare delivery as it is right now. Next one over. So now the late majority is things that are having to do with cost optimization and taking what you have and stratifying it to match the resource that you went. So instead of everybody getting the same menu, we're starting to get smarter about, well, maybe you don't need that much because you're healthier. Maybe you need more because you're consuming more. Starting to, match those up, those kinds of things. And so that's called the efficiency play. So that's the sort of late majority. The next one, early majority, is more things that are playing with, being more technologically efficient as well. So online appointments, website redesign, and emailing patients, that's kind of being more consumer facing and being more human-centered a little bit. And next one over. Now the people who are really the early adopters these days are perfecting, it's not that televisits hasn't been around since, the 90s, but they're perfecting the way and the scale and the efficiency model around those kinds of things, as well as remote monitoring with wearables and installed in the home, as well as the data that, is being big data parsed down to be able to really be more fluid with how people resource things. And that is, and then we also have innovators, which is sort of high-risk interventions. These are the people who have dialysis or who have, really, catastrophic claims, those kinds of high-cost individuals. And we'll get to a chart there in a second. And these are all sort of the tech-enabled outcomes. So this whole layer here is really where the disruption can be answered. And this is the fastest moving water. This is the slowest moving water. But let's go to our next chart, which is, here's the current tech spending. So if you look at across payers and hospitals and large, delivery systems, most of their money is spent on their EMR. Millions and millions of dollars to just maintain these monstrous, kind of, monolithic technologies. And very little money is spent on really innovating in this space, relatively. Okay, next one. And Rock Health did kind of a quantification of the trend of funding, and I think that this is, predicted to reach about, this is the 2015 dollars, $2.1 billion. We ended up beating 2014, but also, they're predicting that it's going to be a $7 billion market by 2017. That may be curbed by some of the sort of onslaught of, some of the markets tightening in the latter part of this year, as well as the first part of next year. Next. So all of this falls along a particular rhythm, all right? The rhythm that you have to know is that there's this cost and people asymmetry. On the left side of wellness, and if you just have this mental model, that it helps you to see everything else very clearly. On this side of the spectrum, you've got 80% of the people. This is Ernestine Shepard. This is a woman who is in her late 70s or mid 70s, and she drinks a whole thermos of egg whites every single day. And at one point was facing type 2 diabetes and completely said, "Oh hell no, I'm not going to do that," and started just completely going crazy. She is a designer of her behavior beyond most of where most of us are. I'm trying to think of like what would my trajectory be to where I could drink a whole thermos of egg whites by the time I'm 76. So I'll try to chart that out, but I'm nowhere near it right now. But people like her are 80% of the people are pretty well, and they they might have high risk. Like this gentleman has kind of very very big belly, which is a very high risk thing for cardiometabolic risk. But they cost about 20% of the system. They use 20% of the resources. Whereas over here on the illness scale, only about 20% of the people are consuming 80% of the dollars. And so here is the rub in healthcare. And this is why, both for these people over here, behavior designing their behaviors to be more effective helps to, keep this cost down. But over here, there's more and more interest in, as we bundle these payments for people, and providers and payers go at increasing risk for an entire population of people, these people become much more interesting in terms of solving the problems and the asynchrony of their behaviors. Okay, next one. So why behavior design? Next one. Design thinking, and we're in the D school, basically I looked this up, and it came from kind of a coined term from Herbert Simon in 1969, who's a Nobel laureate, describing design not so much as a physical process, but as a way of thinking. And so for, I think, the rest of the world, they think of design like, well, do you mean interior design, like drapes? Do you mean, making little widgets, like those kinds of things? But I think behavior design is a whole new application of how this can be expanded as a way of thinking. And I really, think it's a mindset more than anything else. Next one. And this is kind of, at least in industrial design and in most design thinking processes, this is kind of how it goes, right? You ideate over here, you produce ideas, you prototype, you test, you get feedback, and then you discuss, and then you go back and you iterate to your next idea. So this is the typical cycle. Next one. And, we were able to succeed as a society in a lot of advances. This is, of course, an older iPod that, really revolutionized the market, because before this it looked like this. That's what an MP3 player looked like before the iPod. And so design matters in that sense. Next one. This is a similar to the group of devices that you see in the display case when you come into the D school here by Jules Sherman. This is a series of wearable sensors that are fashioned into jewelry. And, this is kind of, consistent with what people actually want to wear. And, of course, that's the advent that we're seeing right now. But in healthcare, we get stuck. This is considered new. Like this kind of look and looks like a flip phone from, several years ago. Okay? And it looks very much like the MP3 from a few years ago as well. But then we apply really good design, right? But then what happens is that it doesn't get reimbursed. And so there's a real sort of, aperture constriction of good design and innovation coming through the system, because there's all these gates that are really historic and, create a lot of laggard kind of adoption side of the adoption curve for these nicer designs that even teenagers. A friend of mine has a son with type 1 diabetes, and he wanted a really cool, insulin pump. But his insurer made him get the old crappy one. And so he went into the hospital several times before he became adherent to this old pump, because it wasn't the one that he wanted. It wasn't the low profile one that fit his need to be a cool young guy. Okay, next one. So last year, fourth quarter, President Obama signed an executive order actually requiring federal agencies to incorporate both behavior insights and human-centered design. And the federal agencies are still trying to figure out what that means and how to implement that. Okay, next one. We also, in addition to the healthcare disruption, we have this other sort of amazing wave happening where we know more about the brain and how the brain works and how behavior works than we ever have in human history. And I want to just kind of consolidate this into two metaphors. One is fast brain, So fast brain to me is a shortcut. It's system one thinking from Kahneman. It's kind of, the unconscious mind from psychology, those kinds of things. But I find it to be a shortcut of how to think about when somebody acts impulsively or acts unconsciously, in ways that are unexpected. It's the kind of irrationality that we point to in behavior economics and those kinds of things. Fast brain is, by its definition, I think it's anything that's myelinated, and I'll go through some data, some recent findings that supports that. But once we know that the fast brain is on the move, and also that it drives approximately 95% of our behaviors, we know that behavior design is the only way to, stop that train from running our lives, right? And that's why all of you, of course, are practicing that. Next one. Behavioral psychology contributes a lot of evidence for fast brain, and these are grouped into things like priming, grouping, implicit memory, biases, heuristics. Next one. This is an example of how this plays out clinically. This is two patients who had a colonoscopy. And what they did is they asked them they figured out which one had the most suffering. So patient A actually had a very short colonoscopy, so over and done, less than 10 minutes, but they ended on a very high level of pain, a 7, all right? Whereas this person, patient B, had a protracted, something went wrong. It took a really long time. They were mucking around. Maybe it was a lot of pain, a lot of peaks of pain, so more overall, area under the curve, more overall pain, but it ended at a 1, okay? So then which one? Go ahead. So this is the one that actually had the better experience, because it's how something ends that matters. And that's a fast brain thing. I don't care what my experience is, as long as it ends well, then I'm willing to remember it well and that kind of thing. So it remodels the memory. And we know also that, the memory systems, the area where we have long-term memory, we actually remodel that all the time. And so what we thought we knew in, let's say, 2005 has been changed various versions, and it's mutated over time to usually get rid of all this suffering, and also to make us feel better about what we did, our part in it, and also to make us look better. And so the 2016 version of that same memory is new and improved, it's distorted, and it's in our favor, right? So we know that that's happening. Okay, next one. Another sort of important thing that behavior design and also BJ's model of BMAT helps us to understand better is a person sits in what we call a trigger field in our work. And let's go through this real quick. So he's getting pings over here on his desktop computer that are kind of distracting and bouncing his mind in and out of consciousness. He has stress, like all these things posted over here are like messaging stress, either things he hasn't done or maybe his picture of his boss looking at him ominously. He's listening to maybe a conference call where a bunch of people are saying a bunch of inane things that he's being triggered emotionally. Maybe he's feeling left out. Next one, he's sitting. Sitting is the new smoking. It's a disease, and so he's doing that as well. His lunch is this healthy pizza over here with a grease splotch that really is now in his body. And then he also has this sugar drink that's going on over here to, of course, increase, fat absorption and then his health message is maybe here. And so this is the sort of, big obstacle that most people in the health tech industry are trying to figure out. How do you insert this little peep in the midst of this just huge, shaping, monstrous, trigger field with all of this, like, broadcast triggers, as I call them, like the cake that sits on my countertop. It just continues to say, eat me, all throughout the day until if I'm working late at night, at some point I will give in to the cake. Okay, next one. And we have heuristics about just how we are next to each other. We have mirror neurons that actually pick up on how everybody else is sitting, how everybody else is feeling, and we mirror that and we collectively share an experience. And so this is a workplace. They may seem like they're working alone, but there's social norms like, having your laptop open on this particular thing, having your thing plugged in. Those are all social norms. This guy might be stressing over here and sending anxiety waves to everybody else, and they're all feeling it with their mirror neurons. It's hard to keep up with you. And then they're all norming the fact that they're sitting down. You know, if you have everybody standing up or everybody sitting down, it helps. I mean, you're all sitting and you're causing each other to sit. Thank you. All right, next one. This is an ode to my daughter's favorite singer, who she stayed loyal to despite his Las Vegas downturn, and then he came back recently. And so this is her, my little ode to her. All right, next one. This is basically the idea that in your brain, the me, the sense of me, who I am, if I'm Justin Bieber, is conserved. It means that I have certain ways that I have a personal style. I've tattooed myself in things that pass the test of whether it's me or not me. Notice he doesn't have anything, you know, really weird or like a little Elmo on his, you know, tattoo, because that didn't make the pass of me, but all this other stuff did. Next one, you know, he feels like me. His head is just constantly saying, this is me, yep, it's me, I'm here, and it's constantly running in the background. His facial expressions are determined by this me, not me thing. Whether you're a smiler, whether you're a frowner, or whether you're, you know, a head nodder, or whatever you are, that's all kind of governed by this me, not me center. Next one is body positions. You know, every way in which you're crossing your right, your left, your right over your left over your right, that's you. That's how you feel normal. It's how you feel like I'm here. This is who I am, and that this is what I do. I'm a right leg over left leg person. All right, next one. And self-defenses also has been shown that when we defend ourselves in a specific way, we actually have a tiny dopamine release in our brain, which makes it rewarding to defend ourselves in that way again. So as long as it's not creating catastrophic damage to our lives, which is, you know, what happens with a lot of these addictions and that kind of thing, we're going to continue to play that play until it doesn't work for us, until we can't score anymore. Okay, next one. Second concept that I think is important to disrupt, you know, this problem in healthcare using behavior design is really focusing on the slow brain. And I know that we don't in the lab, you know, have a lot of optimism around people being able to control their lives with their slow brain. So we focus a lot on fast brain, making it easy, those kinds of things as the better bet. But we also have to think about, you know, how does the slow brain work and where is it operative, where does it have its strengths? Okay, next one. This is the area where we control our decisions, where we contemplate things, where we plan, and where we have willpower. The problem with this box is that we have a very limited, you know, remember most of our behaviors are on autopilot and are being driven by our fast brain. So that leaves about 5% of our mental activity every day being slow brain stuff, and it burns out over the course of the day. And so we're much more apt to make poor decisions. We're much more apt to make no decisions. We're much more apt to, you know, have no willpower by the end of the day. And so, you know, most of us don't think about this, and I have never seen or heard of a clinical conversation where a doctor is talking about this curve, you know, during the day and being able to make their patients' intentions more successful using this information. Next one. And this asynchrony between the fast brain and the slow brain leads to something I like to call the Homer Simpson dote moment, which is sort of, you know, Homer Simpson's an affable guy and he tries to do his best, but he always just kind of eats the cake before he realizes, doh, I meant to not eat the cake. And that happens to us all the time. And this is, you know, the way that I've staged this out is kind of similar to how the brain is modeling the same thing. Those of you who've heard of neuroplasticity, the neuroplasticity comes in different waves, right? So the first wave is I do something tiny and I do it once or I do it several times. But that's nowhere near the strength of the old habit that is dominant, that is going to kick the ass of my first little effort, you know, my little tiny effort. So what I find to be helpful to people is to understand it in terms of sequences and stages and be able to stage themselves where they're at, you know. And I told the story last Saturday about my best friend in high school. She has this really lifelong habit of dating people that are like her dad and like bullies, you know, who don't treat her well. And so we've been talking for years about how to break this thing, and it's very much driven by her unconscious mind because at the front he always seems like a different guy, and then it takes her a while and then realizes, oh, I'm dating Larry again. So what we were doing is we were talking about how, you know, she talked to this guy, she, you know, really had a great time with him first date. By the third date, she's like, oh, you're Larry. I get it. And she's like, Kyra, I keep dating Larry. I keep dating him over and over again. I'm so frustrated with myself. I'm not getting anywhere. I'm not making any progress. I said, no. It used to take you 3 months to realize that you were dating Larry, and now it only takes you 3 days. So you've actually increased your time of really closing down this gap. So here's how it goes. The red bolt is the fast brain action. So let's say it's like throwing the cookie in my mouth. And then the slow brain action is the orange. You can hit it. A long time goes by, and then the orange happens, and you have that dough moment, like, oh, I didn't mean to eat those cookies last night, so a long time, 12 hours, okay? So then stage 2 is I throw the cookie in my mouth, a shorter time goes by, and then dough, I did it again. That's where she was at, right? Oh, I did it again, but it only took her 3 days this time instead of 3 months. And then actually, the only time you can actually change your behavior is when you have this realization simultaneous or right before the fast brain action is about to happen, So that means that the neuroplasticity is actually competitive. Your new behavior that you've been trying to do or that you've been practicing is actually adult enough to be in sparring in the ring with the old one and be able to maybe, defend itself or even go toe-to-toe or maybe 50-50, split it. And that's where we see a lot of people get frustrated because they feel like a hypocrite because they're saying one thing and they're doing the other and they're relapsing all the time. But it's because they have 2 copies of the same behavior that are sparring out in their brain. And the more they invest in the new one, the stronger that neural network gets built up. And the more myelin it gets and all the sort of biochemistry works for it, and it becomes the new default. Okay. Motivation to me in the brain, when you look at it through all of the neuroscience, is basically like this. The brain is like the surface of the ocean and a deep ocean. There's things that are always on, that are very strong, that are called up very quickly, and there's other things that kind of have a very short half-life. So a surface wave, like let's say this wave is happening of, I want to clean my closet, and this other one comes up like my kid is sick. This one actually subsumes the energy of that one and either neutralizes it completely or uses that energy to do something else. And so I think that, my understanding right now of how best to help people understand motivation, in particular because they tend to beat themselves up for not being motivated enough, is to give them this mental model of how motivation works in their brain so that they can be in charge of it, so that they can go, oh, it's not that I didn't have enough motivation, it's that this other motivation, took that energy, and the one that I wanted was unstable, right? It came from my slow brain. Next one. And we saw this with, very significant research out of nematodes, which is the only known animal to have a connectome, which is that we know where every wire in its nervous system goes to every other nerve, right? It has like a brain of 125 neurons. It has a total of 300 neurons, and we are able to know, not me, but researchers can know every single wire and pathway that the nematode experiences. So it only has about 14 behaviors that it could possibly exhibit. Running from something, pursuing food, getting, caught up, kind of being bored, like those kinds of things. And what they found was that the thing that determined what the nematode did was a thing that happened to it right before, right? So they had specific correlations and causation that they could map of, if this, then that. If nematode did this or was pursued, then it dodged to the right, always, 100%, because it was such a simple animal, it's easy to make those connections. Next one. So I've come to think of it in terms of, the surface motivations being like this. The unstable versions is, hit it. These are like aspirations, impulses, things that are outside of ourselves, that are not internally motivated, that are not intrinsically motivated. These are more unstable. Go back, sorry. These are more unstable versus the deeper ones that are always on is kind of the self-image, and we talked about that with Justin Bieber. Those are the things that drive and filter and are always reliable to pretty much give us that predetermined behavior. Things that are long-term, like our family, our values, those kinds of things that have these like sort of neural networks which are very, very robust. And then intrinsic motivation, the areas of the brain that process extrinsic and intrinsic motivation are very different. Extrinsic is linked to the area that makes us feel subservient to other people, that they're in charge of us, versus intrinsic motivation is something where we feel like we're in charge. And that's a very significant difference in the brain activity that we see. Next one. This is the part that I was talking about in terms of, very specific, this is like the nematode on 100 billion, neurons. So this is a human brain that Emily Finn and her group at Yale had scanned people, and they scanned a number of people, and they found that each brain, when triggered a specific way, responded kind of like the nematode in the same predictable way. You know, so usually when you do fMRI scans, you consolidate everybody's and you aggregate and crowdsource everybody's data and find patterns. In this case, she did each person individually and kept them individual and proved that we have this kind of fingerprint, if you will, of how our brain works, which makes us more predictive. And of course, you know, those of you who are athletes and know, you know, certain moves that you always do, or if you play an opponent enough, you know what their moves are. Think about these, you know, high-level tennis players that always play themselves or each other, and they know where so-and-so is going to go over here or over there, or pull their move, or those kinds of things. And so that's the kind of, you know, embedded, you know, programming that proves that there is a fast brain, that there is a slow brain, and that we have, you know, a lot that we rely on that just runs on autopilot. Next one. So, you know, I talked to Dennis Boyle, you know, here at the D School about this, and he said, you know, make the good fast and make the bad slow is basically the way in which you disrupt some of this, you know, asynchrony between people wanting to do A, but then they end up doing B, right? So next one. You can just go through all these. There we go. And this is consistent with BJ's work on BMAT, you know, the ability to have your shoes by the door, the ease with which that happens, and the sort of slow brain thinking about it the night before and putting it out there helps your fast brain not ignore it in the morning. Next one. And you see this with, you know, like, for example, I have a problem with, you know, carbs on the counter. If I have carbs on the counter, they're going in my mouth, and so I either have to freeze them or I have to throw them away. There is absolutely no negotiating with that. Next one. And Google had this same story. You know, they had this M&M consumption that was just off the charts because people did a lot of computer work, and that drives your brain to want simple sugars throughout the day. And so for those of us who spend a lot of time on just thinking all day, we want simple sugars, and of course that's really bad for them. So what they did was they put them in a closed container where you had to like unscrew it in front of everybody else, and it was lower than your waist, and so you had to kind of crouch over and really kind of embarrass yourself and go against social norms. So they really were able to plummet the M&M consumption that way. So behavior change, a couple words on that. So this is the synthesis of everything, you know, healthcare coming together with behavior design and why that's so essential. There's three problems. If we leave it up to chance and we don't behavior design, there's three problems why we will not get what we want. Number one, humans are fundamentally bad at predicting what will make us happy. Number two, we're almost equally as bad at predicting what we will do in the future, you know. And number three, we really don't like change. In fact, we really just hate groundlessness. We don't like to feel like we don't know what's going on, or we don't know, you know, that thing. We don't like to be in unfamiliar territory. All right, next one. The social field also matters as a shaper of behavior change. We talked about trigger fields before, but this is a more social dimension of that. Next one. Andrew actually helped me do research on this, and we came up with kind of a spouse effect where there was three types of spouses. There was the, and they had 25 to 50% sway on whether you did a behavior or not. Next one. There's the supportive spouse. There's the hypocrite spouse, which is you do this, but I'll do this other thing. You know, do what I say, not what I do, exactly. And there's the active saboteur, like, you know, we're going to Applebee's this Friday, and, you know, good luck with your diet, that kind of thing. All right, so big effect there. So how do we empower the slow brain? There has to be design time that is set aside for the slow brain in order for the sort of the metacognitive part of ourselves to control the monkey mind part of ourselves. And that, as far as I know, it involves tracking behavior patterns of some kind and awareness. And tracking is inclusive of experimentation. You know, being able to isolate an experiment and have an experimental method is what makes Toyota one of the most, you know, premier operational models that nobody's ever been able to replicate on the planet, right? But not thinking like a scientist, and kind of, we've talked to a lot of patients who try a bunch of things all at once, you know, and they have experiments, but there are a lot of crazy experiments, and they're not isolated, and they're not really, concise, and so their brain gets really confused. That's not slow brain time, that's just chaos. Okay, next one. And we see that, the brain has a tendency to ruminate, okay? In the prefrontal cortex in particular, the same area that contains my self-image, who I think I am, who Kyra is and who Kyra is not, what she wears and what she doesn't wear, will ruminate on things like, how do people think of me? Why didn't they call me back? Do you ever send an email or send a thing and then nobody responds? And you're like, yeah, it makes you ruminate on your own worth, your own value, your own social capital, those kinds of things. And so it's that worrying, and it's that kind of introspection that really goes awry and over samples. And actually it's been shown to be associated with both an elevated, you can see in here, this is people with major depressive disorder and people with controls. Major depressive disorder has off the charts signal in these areas, as well as anxiety disorders. And so it's causative to anxiety and depressive symptoms to have this going on unchecked. Next one. So the only solution that I'm aware of right now is getting into a meta-awareness state, a metacognitive state. And that's, kind of self-control, concentration, well-being are had as side effects instead of the anxiety and depression. Next one. This is the mind wandering without meta-awareness. This is somebody who's not been trained in mindfulness or meta-awareness at all. They're just like monkey mind. They're just, and you can imagine with a storm cloud system like that, at some point it's going to rain on the rumination area, and then you're going to start a little fire there, and it's going to, start going. Next one. But if somebody's trained in meta-awareness, you can see that it really dampens down and isolates these areas of executive control, and you don't have this kind of out of control, I'm not in control of how I feel about life experience. Next one. And here at Stanford, they did an actual intervention where they had people walk for 90 minutes. I know BJ was doing nature design. Was that this last? Yeah. And what they found is that even after 90 minutes of walking, and I don't know whether they could do a shorter walk, but dramatic significant reductions in rumination as well as these depressive and anxiety symptoms just from walking. So, mindfulness is a really, rapidly spreading concept right now. I think it's kind of the intuitive antidote that we are gravitating towards, as instead of being stimulated and overstimulated and having our minds fractured by these technologies, that we have a yearning to reconsolidate. And actually, Richie Davidson at Wisconsin, one of my favorite neuroscientists, actually identified that having stable concentration is one of the feedback mechanisms inside of ourselves that make us feel like we have well-being. It's one of the 4 pillars of well-being. And so we're yearning for this kind of consolidated concentration, even though our fast brain is being popped around and constantly triggered. So we're more focused. We can, open monitor our experience instead of getting caught in it. It's been associated with much lower cortisol, stress hormones, and also it lends itself to what's called loving kindness or compassion practice that I think is a really essential element of designing in healthcare. I mean, I really appreciate the empathy. I think that's a huge advance in design thinking, but I think for healthcare specifically, we have to go beyond that into compassion. And there's actually research that Richie Davidson also did on people who were trained in empathy versus compassion, and those that had empathy-only training couldn't really bear the suffering of other people, versus people who had compassion training as an adjunct, and including the empathy people who later got compassion training, they were able to withstand suffering that is very common in use cases and problem solving in healthcare. We have to look at some of the most difficult things that happen to humans and be able to sit with that and stay with that. And I know as a medical student, I noticed very specifically and acutely where people just shut down, and they kept shutting down year over year, first year, second year, third year. The more we got subjected to experiences that we didn't know what to do with, and we weren't trained in the skills of compassion, the more either people had to burn out or they had to shut down. And I want to see us design, the behaviors of being present with people, even in the midst of intense suffering. Next one. Another sort of neuroscience fun fact for me is the impact of awe, or how our brain registers awe. And I think this is another slow brain medicine, if you will, for healthcare and those who are in healthcare. Is this is out of the Greater Good Lab in Berkeley, who I love, and they did a study where they had 2 groups of people. One of them looked at a very tall building. The other group looked at tall trees, like redwood trees. And they then measured, how generous they were, how grateful they were, how self-absorbed they were, how much well-being they felt. And in every single case, those that looked at the trees felt more well-being, felt more calm, felt more generous towards other people, felt more empathy towards other people, and just overall kind of not independent-minded, but social-minded and contributor, communal-minded, if you will. So all this points to the designer mindset. And I think for me, where I'm sitting right now is there's 3 elements to it. Number 1 is the ability to experiment in a discrete manner and not all over the place. Number 2, the ability to iterate and be able to detect when one should iterate, when something's kind of falling apart or not working, and also not blaming the initial experiment, but keeping that scientific mindset where, okay, I just got to figure out the right design. I'm not done, I'm not a failure, I just got to keep iterating through this. And then the third one is understanding that no matter how successful in healthcare, a behavior change design will expire on you, whether it's because you get injured or whether because you age or you move or your doctor retires or whatever happens, there's something that's going to happen. And I'm going to finish on my story. So there was a point where exercise for me became increasingly difficult because it hurt. I was more sore. I was, I don't think I had full arthritis, but just like a little achy, in doing the exercise. It was not as enjoyable. And, my experience of just like throwing my body into a full sprint didn't feel as good. And so I couldn't kick my own butt. I really was watching myself at the gym shave a little bit of intensity off every single time. And over the time, I had drifted off course into this very low kind of level of challenge to myself. So I'm like, what do I do? Next thing I tried was, I was like, I'm going to do high intensity things. So I tried sprinting in the park, and I was really interested in this, sort of like this research out of Britain about high intensity training. And I started like kicking my own butt just for 2 minutes and being exhausted and seeing how that would work and being more efficient too, because then you don't have to work out as long. And what happened then was I became injured. And it turns out that, next one, I took a rest and I just watched a lot of HGTV. And I thought about what I wanted to do. I finally went into the orthopedic doctor and had an MRI, and it turns out that I had a 20 to 30% tear of my hamstring on my left side off of my sitting bone, my ischial bone. So I actually had legitimate, even though I didn't want to admit it, I had a legitimate injury. And I was like, but I can't stop running because I'm a runner. That's my self-image. That's how I exercise, right? So I couldn't, he said to me, well, I'm just going to inject this with steroids and then you're going to go run again and you're going to mess it all up. I go, no, I won't. And I didn't. I stopped running, but it was like I was in this crisis. So next thing I did was, and I'm also a beginner surfer, this is me on my honeymoon last year. Next one. So I did a boot camp, which didn't seem to exacerbate that area of my body as much. And the good thing about it was that I was exhausted, everybody else was exhausted. We didn't have enough time to judge each other or energy to like judge each other or assess how am I doing against anybody else, because we're all dying simultaneously, privately and together. Okay, so next one. And I did a little more HGTV because I actually injured myself further with the boot camp. Next one. So I went to functional training, which is actually, kind of posterior chain training. I found this awesome trainer who helps to do mild things that are really, really hard with your body. It challenges your strength and your balance and all those things simultaneously. And I really love functional training now. Next one. And I joined the YMCA. And that way I can scale up and down and also have enough variety in the way that I exercise at this point. So that's my current state. And I also went to a yoga retreat with my daughter recently, who was in college. And she said, Mom, I want to, for my spring break, instead of going to Baja and getting drunk with everybody, I want to go on a yoga retreat with you. And I was like, oh my God, I can't believe that. I raised you right, and things like that. I know part of it was financial and she didn't have any money, but still, I was very flattered. And so, we went to this yoga retreat and I watched people do things like this. It was amazing. And she and I had that mother bonding. So I throw in things like this as well. All this to say that I have a designer mindset about my exercise. And that's, again, piecing it out. Experimentation, which means one at a time. Iteration, which means tinker and tweak the whole time. Now I'm in the YMCA and adding yoga retreats. And then expiration, which means there's no failure. The fact that I'm not a runner anymore doesn't make me a failure. It just means that I have to find my next thing, my next design. Next one. So people who design, in conclusion, their behaviors are uniquely empowered, creative, and successful in changing their experience, health, and life. And my hope is that, through this work, through the behavior design community, that we can make a difference. We can move the needle in terms of this mindset and actually make people successful, because in every single case, whether they call themselves designers or not, people who succeed in changing their behavior are thinking like designers. They just maybe have never heard of that term. Excellent. I hope this helps you to change the world further. And, because I know that you guys are all behavior changers as well as myself, and we have to make a difference here. So now we went over a little bit about understanding healthcare, why behavior design is absolutely essential to changing healthcare and making it better, and a little bit about how to apply that to behavior change. May you live a well-designed life. Thank you, guys. So questions, or comments? PJ?
I'll start. So your training as a medical doctor, how does that figure in for better or for worse? I imagine now that you're focused on behavior design and neuro and things like that.
Right. So I'm going to repeat the question because of the recording volume. So you asked, how does my medical doctor background affect shape, for good or bad, being a behavior designer or wanting to design behaviors? I think that one of the things that it hinders me on is this very algorithmic mindset that I was trained in, of this has to be like that, or, evidence-based and that kind of thing. So I think the way that I resolve that is I look at science and I apply it so that I feel more comfortable, like I've satiated that part of myself that was trained to look at the world through that. I think that the benefit in terms of healthcare design is that I've seen what doesn't work well. I've seen people suffer. I've seen people avoid people who are suffering in their hospital rooms, or not go tend to them, or I've seen medical errors. I've seen surgeries. I wish everybody who was designing for people's health could see the intimacy that occurs when somebody's vulnerable and they give you permission to go to the deepest, darkest place of their suffering and to be there with them. That has always been a gift, and I've always dedicated myself and my work to those people who have taught me. They're my teachers in that way.
What's going on, or what do you think is going on with self-sabotage?
So my current thesis on that is that the self-image center almost acts like a tethering point. And so if you imagine like a bungee cord coming off that tethering point, and you see this with rapid weight loss, when somebody loses a lot of weight and they don't recognize the body that they're in anymore, there's actually psychological diseases where you can't relate to your body. Either body dysmorphia, like Michael Jackson had, where you're constantly changing it and making it look different, or people who don't think this limb needs to be here and they cut it off. So take that back a bit out of the really bizarre land, and just do it like common everyday garden variety version of that is, I'm not a person who is 190 pounds. I'm a person who's 300 pounds. That sort of tether point of who you thought you were for so many times, or I'm the fat kid, or I'm all these things, continues to pull you back into self-sabotaging. I think the other thing, the other version for myself, I know, is kind of this inner teenager of like wanting to be a little rebellious and a little bit naughty sometimes when I've been too good, and just balancing out, if I've been too aesthetic about something, I want to come back and be a little naughty.
So with one of the slides earlier, you talked about the fast brain and then the conscious brain and the stages. So you do something and then 3 months later you're like, no, I shouldn't have done that. And eventually you move to the place where that thought comes either right as you're about to take the action or before in a period of time. How do you move people through that faster? Like, what are some of the things or ways that people can move, when they notice it, how do they start to move that back?
Right. So the question is, what's that?
Yeah. So stop dating Larry's faster.
How can you stop dating Larry's faster? Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that being in a rapid feedback environment, like a friend of mine is, as you know, a nun in a meditation community. And that thing is locked down. Social norms are like on lock. And so you try to do something deviant in that, it's immediately reflected, it stands out like a sore thumb, right? So I think that's one way that I can think of that does that. But in terms of just the neurochemistry of it, I think that a tree's girth just takes a while to build that girth. And you can put stakes in the ground and tie tethers around it and keep it straight and that kind of thing, those kind of external braces, and you can brace it like with the social environment. But you know, when you take away the braces, it has to be a certain girth in order to stand on its own.
So in your friend's case, it might have been every time she starts dating someone new, she could have designed by saying, I'm going to call up Kyra, and we're just going to have a list of questions she's going to ask me that might signal to me earlier.
Right.
So it's like, cool, I go on a first date, that triggers me to call Kyra.
You have a system to
Your
accelerate
system,
your awareness.
yeah.
Exactly. I think the other thing is that, you know, significant emotional events like PTSD, they create, you know, they melt neurons together. And so even though they're not well organized, it's more like a tumor where it's just kind of all over the place, mishmash together, but they reliably wire together from that point forward, and you don't want to touch the stove again, right? Yeah.
So kind of building on that.
Yeah.
The other day in my education class, a student asked about they wanted to eat, you know, they didn't want to eat a pound of French fries every night, and I said it's hard to eliminate a behavior, but substitute, like, well, go to yoga at 6 o'clock instead. How does that play in terms of the neuroscience of saying instead of denying yourself something, because it's hard to feel a sense of accomplishment, like do less, do less, do less.
Right.
But instead, you know, redirect that.
Right.
What have you found in the research on that?
So your question is about, you know, can you substitute a better behavior, you know, instead of eating a pound of fries, can you go to yoga or those kinds of things? I find that the stickiness of that is determined by the heuristic matching and the sensory matching of the experience. So I've talked to patients that, you know, they have to have fried food or they don't think they've eaten. Or somebody like myself, I have to feel a stomach stretch or I don't feel like I've eaten. So that 6 small meal diet sucks for people like me. Like it's just like a sieve. I will just eat all day until I fall asleep, you know? And so, you know, the heuristics, knowing your own heuristic profile and what that behavior is sitting on top of, what the checklist is, sensory-wise. Is it warm? Is it crunchy? Is it, you know, is it the fact that I take 20 minutes to make the fries and I feel like I'm homemaking, I'm nesting? You know, like what is it that's sitting underneath that? Because that determines whether the substitute is acceptable or not, you know, and whether it really substitutes or not. And I've seen a lot of leaks where, you know, it maybe got 80% of the list, but there's this one thing that it didn't satisfy, and then relapse happens because that one thing hasn't been accounted for.
If you could get 20% of the world to do one thing every single day for the rest of their lives, what would you have them do?
If I could get 20% of the world to do one thing for the rest of their life, be grateful. That's the chief operating script in the well-being sequence, as far as I understand it.
Have you done any work with youth?
With youth?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I'm very interested in youth wellness. And the prefrontal cortex is now developed. So a lot of
It's all
these
over the
things will be
place.
different.
Yep.
So if you could please share a little bit of that.
What's the specific
So
question?
If you have worked with them,
Yeah.
like,
But
how things were different.
how things are
in your
different.
design.
Yeah, right, exactly. So working with teenagers, specifically teenage young men who were in incarcerated settings or in gangs or that kind of thing, I think that the biggest difference, at least in that populations, may not be as the same with like middle class or upper middle class youth. But for them, there was a lot of relapse that I had to figure out an equation to de-shame them. And that's where I came up with the sort of, you know, you're not bad, you're not alone, and there's a way out. You have to check, that's the checklist to get them to go through that. The other thing about the teenagers specifically is the second they think that it's your idea, they will reject and rebel just based on that fact alone. And so you always have to be, you know, I want you to get what you want. That they're naturally inherently narcissistic, and that's not a bad thing. It's not an unhealthy thing at that age. It's if they don't mature out of it that it's unhealthy. But you know, being able to say, I want you to get what you want, and being on their side in that way, then they let their guard down. Then they share what they care about. And as long as I'm not more eager than they are about an opportunity, then they will continue to be in control. Their intrinsic motivation will not be robbed by my enthusiasm. I think that's the biggest mistake that I see adults do, is they like, oh, I can be more excited than you about that. Let me just take that, or let me remind you about it, or let me ask you about it, or whatever. and then they're like, forget it, too much pressure. It's about you, not me.
Maybe for middle class or high class, we need to tweak it or do things differently.
Well, all of them have that same script.
Because
You
there's
know.
a lot of peer pressure also.
Well, peer pressure too. It's just self-protective. Yeah, exactly.
So I know you've been involved in mindfulness for a long time.
Yes, we did the little.
Yes, and my sense is that in American culture, it's becoming more and more popular and talked about. There's a trend. So my question, one is like, am I saying things clearly? And two, what's behind the growing kind of awareness and popularity of mindfulness? How do you interpret that, or how do you see that?
Yeah. So the question is, is it a fad or a trend? Is that real? And then what do I see driving that? So as I said before, I think that the main thing that's driving it is the anxiety and the sort of depression going off the charts as we use technology. So people who use Facebook, habitually, major super users of Facebook have a side effect of just a lot of depression because their ruminative areas are triggered more than if you weren't. We've never had young minds exposed so repetitively to how am I doing? What do they think of me? Fear of missing out. We actually have, FOMO. We have with words for it, and so there's new psychological triggers that are happening all the time. And, I looked at some data recently about college-aged anxiety levels have skyrocketed in the last several years, just last 3 years, even 4 years. So I think those curves are being met with a desire to be in control, to have metacognitive experience, and to have consolidated attention that is right now being fractured. And so it's kind of our knee-jerk reaction to that. I also think that the science has hit a certain point of being convincing to even, there's a tipping point in the science of, oh, it's good for this, it's good for that. It's kind of like, duct tape. It's good for so many things, and people realize that.
So if you could design an experiment, kind of like the 90-minute walking thing, where you're not just testing for rumination levels, what would you test for to see like what's impacting? So for instance, like in that experiment, if my understanding is correct, after they went on the 90-minute walk, you had less levels of rumination, correct?
Right, that's right.
And so what is an experiment that could be similar, maybe shorter, and maybe test for rumination, but what else would you test for instead of rumination? Like that would have an impact on proving or showing correlations of like, walking or doing the thing helps them be less anxious or something like that.
Yeah, I think one of the my favorite variables is heart rate variability.
Okay.
Both in exercise and sports, as well as the ability to self-regulate one's mind and emotions, and it's kind of a really reliable, robust metric,
Okay.
that hasn't been correlated. And when I was doing the mind-body stress reduction study, at scale, we didn't do cortisol. We did HRV because it was more reliable. Because cortisol has kind of a biphasic appearance in the body. So you could be really stressed, but if you're really stressed chronically, you actually have a drop in cortisol, and it no longer becomes reliable.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you, as a persuasive technology angle, so you were saying that with Facebook it kicks off more rumination. If you wanted to be a responsible tech designer of these technologies, how would you tweak Facebook so that it would reduce rumination?
I think Facebook is working on this. I went to Facebook Research Day a couple years ago, I think, and they're working on how do we make the norm of how people interact kindness or respect or those kinds of things. So I think that they're looking at sort of the benefits of designing for these kind of social norms and that kind of thing. I don't know that they can get around the fact that they need eyeballs and as many and as long eyeballs. TV's kind of like that too. They're just in a position where their revenue model is driven off of people paying more attention to them than less attention to them. But I know there's designers and developers inside of them and Google that are really thinking about this and trying to solve for these problems to make it more balanced. Yeah.
What do you think about fitness trackers? Are they working? Are they a waste of time? Is it like an opportunity that's not quite right?
Right. So I think I said this. The thing that really got my attention at the last Consumer Technology Association meeting was that it's a misnomer to call them fitness trackers because they're not actually tracking fitness; they're tracking steps or maybe activity. But I think that the emotional intelligence layer to those, in terms of expectations that are set, how they talk to people, how they recover and change the use case when it's important, those kinds of things are yet to be designed. And I hope that the companies that are at the fore of that will design those things. Yes, absolutely. Thank you guys.